Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you all. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here. I find myself a little out of place to be in the august company, winding up with prime number 19, this series. If I have any notoriety at all, it's within a tiny community, tiny but wonderful community of cartographers and GIS people. So again, it's a real pleasure to be here. It's also been a pleasure to be here for the day. So I flew into Cleveland and drove here last night. And thanks to Ben and company, met with several local people, including at Gannon University. And I'm really impressed with this community. I grew up in Indianapolis, and it's much like my memories of my Hoosier childhood, perhaps a little bit smaller in terms of population, but clearly a special community. As Ben mentioned, I'm going to be using my own little medium to tell my story tonight, and that comes with a little bit of risk. Most people you've watched here have probably used PowerPoint. I have officially retired from PowerPoint because I like this medium. Despite the fact that, sometimes bandwidth can fail you, sometimes unfamiliar trackpads can fail you. So if I don't scroll with adequate skill, please forgive me. But at any rate, let's just plunge in. So I am going to be talking about making maps and telling stories and opening minds. And the first two I've accomplished. The third, of course, is just a hope that some of the work that I and we have done do help open some minds. But at any rate, I grew up loving maps and somehow sort of vaguely realized that they're a universal language. And of course, stories are very much a part of what we are as humans, and they're as old as speech, and of course, intimately tied with speech. And together, I feel very strongly they do have the power to open minds to the world, and it's often threatened wonders. So a little bit first, see, here we go. Sorry, stop it, go away now. Okay, people have been telling stories ever since they developed the power of speech. And so when you think about it, for most of human history, oral stories were really the only way we passed culture on from one to the next. But fast forward today, of course, stories retain their power. And in fact, we live truly in a golden age of storytelling. We binge on storytelling thanks to these streaming services, thanks to the medium of the web that we all spend probably too much time on. Meanwhile, maps have told stories in their own special ways for thousands and thousands of years, sometimes scratched in the sand, sometimes engraved in elaborate form like this Waldseemüller map, which is at the Library of Congress. And of course, they express our knowledge of the world, but they also sometimes not always consciously reflect cultural viewpoints. Here we go again. I will get used to this as we go. You just have to watch me learn very slowly to deal with this. So apologies about that. So they can provide sometimes surprising glimpses into cultural viewpoints. And some of you may be familiar with this, is an amazing so-called stick map. The little shells represent islands scattered across the Pacific. And of course, the Polynesians were able to navigate these miraculous distances using their learned knowledge, sometimes passed on in forms like this. Sometimes maps reflect and express biases very obviously and brutally. More often, those biases are more subtle. So in the 20th century, mapmaking was a very specialized skill, mostly performed by an elite group of mostly white male specialists, although you see women in this picture. This is an archival picture from National Geographic, my alma mater in a way, but well before my time, back in the 20s or so. And of course, those maps were published by elite organizations like the National Geographic Society. And sometimes those organizations had biases that they weren't conscious of. And for much of my career at National Geographic, I didn't think very much about. So I often, actually every day, I would walk into the map division that I've had the honor of heading for about 12 years before I came to Esri. And there was a plaque on the wall, and the plaque quoted Gilbert H. Grosvenor, a longtime editor of the magazine, saying, "A map is the greatest of all epic poems. Its lines and colors show the realization of great dreams." And he's right, of course, but it took me a decade or two of walking by that before realizing that, of course, whose dreams did it represent? There are lots of people who didn't have the reach and the kind of imperial consciousness that literally wrote the boundaries of the maps around the world. So I think we cartographers have a growing awareness that we've got a broader responsibility than we might have exercised before. At any rate, I began work at National Geographic in 1983. I had been freelancing as a designer and illustrator, and I'd always thought, I love that work. I loved freelancing, and I always thought I'd give it up only if the ideal job came along, and the only ideal job I could imagine was in the art department of National Geographic magazine. And lo and behold, it happened. And then after a couple of stints in the back and forth between the magazine art department and the then called Cartographic division, I found myself in the position of heading that division and inheriting this amazing tradition that of innovation and artistry that had gone on for decades. Among my favorites, I of course didn't have a chance to meet these people like Bumstead and Ritterford, but this Natalie dressed fellow Charles Ritterford is the one who designed these beautiful, beautiful typefaces that grace National Geographic's maps and have long since been digitized. So I was very, very fortunate to inherit this amazing tradition. And at that point, when I first started working in the map division, actually before, when I was still in the magazine staff, they had started this arduous transition from analog to digital. And in a way, we've all been through this arduous transition, but it was an especially painful and difficult one in terms of cartography. So when I started at National Geographic, this fellow was working in an air-conditioned room with a vast piece of machinery behind me, all of which, of course, served the purposes of doing pre-production work for maps in the magazine. And that big, massive room-filling computer was only a tiny fraction as powerful as the phones that we carry around in our pocket these days. The division at that point had already started to use Esri's software in very early form as in a sort of experimental way. So back in the, I think, late 50s and early 60s, the Society had compiled as a series of supplement maps to the magazine, a series of atlas plates that were ultimately assembled into a world atlas. Thousands of beautifully, meticulously hand-placed place names, and there's the famous sort of tint bands that represent international boundaries. So yeah, the first world atlas was published in 1963, and not again, fast forward to the 80s when I was there, they began the process of digitizing those atlas plates. So that meant agonizing use of styluses and big light tables to turn those individual atlas plates into geodatabases. So using Esri software, they became part of a GIS system, but each one of those atlas plates represented, they were different projections, different ways of flattening the various parts of the earth, different scales, to some extent other treatments as well. So in my era, I took the next step, which was to help urge the group, with help from Esri, to take those atlas plates and use other data sources to then seam them together into a nested set of world coverages at different scales. And that meant that you could, instead of having individually to take those separate databases and turn them into maps, you had this seamless resource that you could work with, and you could kind of choose the scale and resolution. So that was another step that was important. And of course, fast forward to today, and we're constantly using tools that we couldn't have really even imagined only 30, 40 years ago, that enable us holding these devices to zoom from street level to planet level, and to take this geographic data and to represent it in the style of National Geographic and many other styles at the same time. So it represents a revolution that we tend to take for granted, but represents a huge amount of work, both in terms of the development of technology, but especially in terms of just raw human labor to digitize all this information. Meanwhile, I learned sometimes the hard way as chief cartographer at National Geographic that people really care about maps, and they especially really care about National Geographic maps. And so we were very, very careful to represent boundaries and other elements cartographically as objectively and meticulously as possible. So that meant basically using what we called a de facto policy. So we chose to depict the world not as any one individual or group wanted it to be depicted, but as it was on the ground, for better or worse. And then when we felt it necessary, we would add a note to a map to kind of explain as briefly as possible why we're representing the world that way. Anyway, I have a vague memory of a map researcher coming to me one day back in this is probably the late 90s, saying, you know, more and more people are referring to the Persian Gulf as the Arabian Gulf. Shouldn't we add it as a secondary name? And I thought, sure, why not? Let's do it. So the next edition of the Atlas, here it is. You see the Arabian Gulf in parentheses below Persian Gulf. Several years went by, and then the Iranian and the Iranian American communities realized what we had done. And overnight, the president of the society and I had our email boxes overwhelmed with complaints, some of them not repeatable in a mixed audience like this, blaming us for kowtowing to the politics of the region. So one of those emails accused me of being an Arab bribed moron. And it's one thing as Americans to know that there are people in the Middle East who are not happy with us, but to have that ire aimed at you personally is quite a unique feeling. We had to change our home phone number to an unlisted one because my wife got a call at 6 a.m. from somebody very upset about it. Well, it turns out that their complaints were to some extent justified, and that term was politically charged. Of course, the Arabian Gulf, as the Iranians or Persians, as they like to think of themselves, saw it as an act of kind of political aggression. So we quietly and carefully backed off and added a note saying, most commonly known as the Persian Gulf, some refer to this body of water as the Arabian Gulf, and that was enough to satisfy the critics. At any rate, one of the things that I most enjoyed in my tenure at National Geographic, this was back in the era. How many of you remember getting the supplement maps in National Geographic magazine? Oh, great. A lot of you. We used to think of the magazine as the container for those maps. And we spent a lot of time, as a designer, it's a fascinating challenge to, sorry about this. I told you I'd learn and I still haven't yet. But it was a really interesting and exciting challenge to figure out how on a single large sheet of paper to represent the world or a chunk of it, and to do it in a way that formed a narrative. So we used every trick in the trade to try to establish a sort of hierarchy of visuals, to have a main element like this map of ecoregions in Africa, to use smaller thematic maps, to use artwork. In this case, the artwork also served to, these supplements, of course, folded. And so you had to also design it so that what you initially saw on the folded map looked nice in itself, but also looked nice in the larger context. So it involved this really careful thinking about hierarchy and sort of gridded information. Also layering information really carefully. So making the large city names larger type and the smaller elements smaller type, of course, and adding semi-transparent generalized arrows for major migration routes and narrower routes for actual tracked individual birds, that sort of thing. So it was a really fascinating effort to try to turn a map on a sheet of paper into a story. So now suddenly we find ourselves in the digital age. Sorry, here we go again. I'm going to make you dizzy. So as we were working on these supplement maps, of course, the web was being born. And I started to think about now, how can we move this tradition into this very new medium? Especially thinking that National Geographic, at least back then, was known for two things. One is for beautiful images, and I reluctantly admit that comes first. And second, beautiful maps. And couldn't we use this new medium and its interactivity to combine those two to tell stories? So we came up with, I hired a fellow who'd worked at the Nature Conservancy, and we worked with a little outside firm and developed what we called Geostories. And this is a little animation of one. So the map moves you from place to place as the narrative moves you from place to place with photos and brief text. And I thought this is pretty cool, but it unfortunately it really kind of failed to resonate at National Geographic. And this was at a time when I used the term G word, that people at National Geographic were actively kind of embarrassed that they had to do with geography, which they saw as a static, old-fashioned kind of dying realm or art and science at the very time, ironically, that it was exploding thanks to the internet, thanks to computerization, thanks to remote sensing, thanks to geographic information systems. So during this period, I'd gotten to know Esri, I'd gotten to know its amazing user community, and I'd gotten to know its founder and still president, Jack Dangermond. And he invited me to join Esri. And a remarkable organization. I had some fear when I left National Geographic. I'm a starry-eyed idealist, and I was worried that I was going to be entering the for-profit realm and selling my soul. Actually, I knew better because I'd already gotten to know the company. Jack's motivation is to make the world a better place and to empower all sorts of organizations to run cities better, to run those organizations better, to understand how the world works, to protect our natural resources, et cetera. So I entered a for-profit realm that meant there was money to support our efforts to do some interesting stuff, but very much the same, perhaps an even greater commitment to the mission and the knowledge that geography is a powerful thing. I may have to, there shouldn't be a little frowny face there. And now I don't know how to refresh. Second, sorry about this. How can if I can reload the whole story, I'm fine, but I don't have access to the controls. Anybody know? Help! Let's see if everything's like this. I'm gonna have to pause here. Ben, we had a little rehearsal this morning, and we remembered how to go back and forth between these two things, and now I've forgotten. So it's my bad.
That's quite all right. And of course, everything goes well when we practice and do it in rehearsal versus.
There it is, exit full screen.
And you want to refresh?
Let's just refresh, and we can keep it right here because it doesn't. Right back to where we were. Thank you, Ben. Round of applause, please. Wait a minute, I'm gonna have to do it again here. Oh, how mystifying. I'm going to have to explain. I'll just wave my arms. By the way, at the end of this is a little QR code, and you can copy it and open this map when it's behaving, this story when it's behaving better. So what I have done is I've embedded some stories within a story. And so without seeing the visual, and I apologize for this, what we did was after I joined Esri, we assembled a small team, and we started to, we were charged by Jack to kind of figure this thing out, whatever this thing is. He wanted to make maps more accessible to more people and to tell stories with maps. So I assembled a small team. We'd assign ourselves stories. One of the early ones we did was to map enable. We were coming up on the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. So we map enabled the the passenger list and discovered amazing patterns. The first class people were tended to be from major cities in Europe and the US, or going to major cities. And the steerage passengers were from little villages in Ireland and Scandinavia and the Levant and elsewhere. And the fatality rate, of course, among the steerage passengers was much higher. So this is an example of how powerful maps can be as storytelling devices. But that was the user experience we developed for that worked for that story, but it wasn't more broadly applicable. But there were other stories. I'm going to just fast forward through some of these non-operable things. There were other patterns that we came up with that we realized other people could use to pour their own content into them. So an example is what we called short lists. So most of our story maps were sequential narratives. This one happened to be a way to browse and view a series of locations in and around a destination like San Diego. Another one that we did was I walked the High Line, the elevated park in New York, and took a bunch of pictures, and we assembled it into a map tour. So it was those applications that we realized other people could take their stuff and put them in. So that was at the point at which we started to develop these configurable apps. So we made the apps available. We provided these builder functions, so people didn't need to know how to do any coding. They didn't need to know CSS and JavaScript and HTML. They could just kind of push buttons and follow our directions to assemble their own stories. So we ultimately created a series of templates, each of which was presented its own way of combining interactive maps with multimedia content, photos, videos, audio, text, etc., to tell stories in various ways. And it just started to take off. We had only the vaguest of notions that these might be useful to people. It was one of those cases sort of on a much smaller scale, sort of like the iPhone, that, you know, it was a brand new thing that nobody had really imagined that much before. There were some custom precursors to story maps, but nothing that was made broadly available. And it just really, really took off. Then in 2019, we took the next step. So of course, I'm a flaky designer and sort of, you know, old-fashioned cartographer. But we brought in a brilliant computer scientist and developer named Satya Prasad, who then kind of professionalized what we were doing on a semi-amateur level, and came up with what we now call ArcGIS story maps. And that this is the same basic idea, but those different user experiences are now all accessible within a single builder. And there are lots of other improvements in terms of working really, really well on mobile devices, on being accessible to, say, visually impaired people, to update and modernize the design. Because by this time, 8 or 9 years into the program, our earlier designs were already starting to feel a little dated. So how do story maps work? I did, in preparation for this talk, and looks like this is actually live, so fingers crossed it'll work. So I just did a simple Google search on Erie story map and came up very quickly with a couple of really nice ones. So this one was done by Penn State and features the wonderful old Sanborn maps. And Sanborn maps were done by, Sanborn was a fire insurance company, and they compiled from many, many American cities these beautifully detailed maps, building by building, assessing their value and risk factor, things like that. So it takes those old maps and creates a kind of, you know, so they georeference those, so made sure that they align with a modern day digital web map, and present them in the form of a map tour. And so one of the, or of a story map, excuse me. And one of the things that story maps do is take you on a tour. So just like Geostories back at National Geographic, this, as you scroll, the map moves from location to location, and you see text and image that goes with it. This is another one of our immersive sections called Sidecar. So the map or other visual stays put in the background as you scroll, but as you go from section to section, the map moves from place to place. We also call this map choreography, and I'll show you another example of that. So the other one, and if anybody here knows who actually produced Active Erie, I'd love to know, because this is quite a beautiful effort. So this is about an effort to, oops, let me go back. Sorry. Being very patient with my technical issues here. Okay, all right, here we go. So Active Erie is essentially a study of how to make Erie more accessible to active outdoors people. So they've done some amazing work. It also shows the power of GIS that is enabled as a story. So these blobs or polygons around locations represent walking distances to Erie landmarks. So that's an important part of the study. And it also takes you on a tour. And this is another element of map choreography. So it's showing you different thematic maps. So this is the percent of population that's disabled in census tracts in and around Erie. So it's important to know that in terms of making sure that sidewalks are well maintained and things like that. Here's the percent of population that's over 65. So remember those supplement maps that showed everything on a single sheet of paper. With story maps, you're taking that and you're parsing it out over time instead of over space. So it's been a really fascinating and wonderful thing to explore and consider how the ancient art of storytelling and the ancient art of cartography kind of crammed into this new medium of the web can tell stories in a lot of ways more powerfully than using old media. So I mentioned the growing popularity of story maps. So they really kind of took off among two constituencies. One is GIS professionals now had a way to communicate their work outside of their back offices where they've traditionally been kind of sequestered. So within their organizations and to the general public, like that Active Erie map, they could say, these are the things that are important to our community. Second audience, we didn't really anticipate, shame on us, but it turns out that students and educators love story maps, and they've exploded in classrooms around the country, around the world, and again in university, among other places. So students are empowered to create these really elegant multimedia narratives that provide a really exciting alternative to traditional research papers. So this graph's a little out of date. We're now over 2.3 million story maps hosted on Esri's cloud service. And this represents a large fraction, but still a fraction of additional stories that are behind firewalls that we can't count. So I don't think I ever would have dreamed that we'd be over, well over 2 million story maps. So these narrative maps, as I mentioned, have come to life in the digital age. So I like to think of it as map used to be a noun, and now map is an active verb. So maps don't just sit there and start to age the instant they're printed. They're alive. They dance and sing, and many of them are continually updated. And so they exercise incredible power. And of course, we all use mapping applications just to find our way around town. So we've maybe given up the visual impact of a giant format sheet and the ability to kind of scan sometimes even thousands of place names visible at a glance. And we've also, I think, perhaps sacrificed longevity. I fear that the story maps I'm so excited about now will be long gone by the time my great-granddaughter might walk into a library, but still find that National Geographic Atlas or those supplement maps. But the benefits are great. So, the fact that the maps are interactive, so you can pan and zoom and look at pop-ups and access all sorts of information. They can update easily. The act of publishing is now so trivial, where at National Geographic, we pore over something, wait 6 months while it went on press. The map would come out, it'd be out of date already, and I would find something immediately on that map that I wish I'd designed in a different way. But now I can just go online, make a few changes, hit refresh, and it's done. So maps stay up to date. They can incorporate dynamic data, things like recent earthquakes or current weather alerts or flood gauge readings, et cetera. they can accommodate this rich multimedia mix, and they can dance, as I told you, in terms of map choreography, the ability simply as you scroll through a narrative to watch that map move from place to place and theme to theme. So here's a little side by side. So this story map on the right that zooms you progressively in toward a water pollution site, a mine site. But as you go, it's changing themes on you, as opposed to the perhaps more beautiful in some ways, but static map on the left. Story Maps has been just one of a whole series of apps that Esri has provided. Things like the ability to put together a survey very quickly that tests that asks people questions. Dashboards. You've all seen the COVID dashboards that have shown the number of cases of COVID around the world. The business and community atlas, or analysts rather. ArcGIS Online, which represents a huge content resource that Story Maps can tap. So all of these things that at early days seemed like a kind of motley collection of random apps have really opened up this formerly specialized world of geographic information systems to billions of people, to all of us. And so that and just the general fact of making so much data available via the web has really revolutionized GIS, and is in the process, we hope, of revolutionizing our understanding of the world. So as I'd say, GIS has burst from the back office and has entered the mainstream. So what's happening now? So just a few months ago, we decided to make good on that notion that Ben mentioned, that story maps ought to be accessible to everyone. So Esri's released its first direct consumer-facing product, which is just simply called Story Maps, and you can find it at storymaps.com. It's specifically for personal storytelling, and it comes without the complex, sometimes complex, but really rich information that the world of GIS provides. It's kind of separate from that. It's got a simpler mapping function, but allows people like outdoor enthusiasts or what's the word, genealogists, et cetera, to tell stories about their family histories or their outings and things. So that's new, and we're still in the process of developing an audience for that, to persuade to get a 50-year-old business-to-business company suddenly start to serve consumers is a bit of a challenge. And so we do have some marketing challenges ahead of us, but I'm really excited about the potential. The next thing we're working on is called story templates. So as user-friendly as we like to think making a story map is, it's still a little bit of a learning curve. So we want story authors to be able to create templates. Say you're a ninth grade teacher and you're teaching biology, and you want to put together a story for your class, or you want to assign your class to do a story map, but you don't want them to have to learn it from scratch. You can create a kind of skeletal story. You will be able to create a kind of skeletal story, share it with your class, and then each student can essentially copy that story and make their own narrative, pouring their own content into it. So that's the basic idea, that you create a template that then many people can make their own and fill in the blanks with their own stuff. So that's the kind of thing that we're working on. Meanwhile, there's just endless possibilities for a need for additional enhancements and features and things. But to rush on to the moral, maps infuse energy and insights into storytelling. So maps really do provide a context and a richness that the other multimedia elements that we see all the time don't necessarily, and they complement those other multimedia elements. So also at National Geographic, I had the great honor of using maps to inform people about the richness of our world and the urgent need to protect it. And at Esri, I've had discovered what Esri people had known all along, but it took me a while to realize how incredibly gratifying it is to help enable people to tell their own stories. So to have millions of people using our tools to tell often important stories about conservation and about sustainability and about social justice and racial inequity and those types of things. It's just been incredibly exciting and gratifying. We're almost at the end, and I still haven't learned, wouldn't you know? And I've just spoiled my own punchline. It's terrible. At any rate, come on. What's happened here? How embarrassing. Okay, we'll try it once more. Oh, it was there for a second. I think it's because we're at the end here. So we really do live at a critical moment in the history of human society and the planet, and we need to use these tools of GIS. They are being used by many, many organizations, but another really important part of that is to extend that knowledge that GIS is gaining for for perhaps a technically able few to many, many people like all of us here, all of our families, all of the rest of the human family, to help ensure a sustainable future. So thank you very much for bearing with me and my technical issues. And I look forward to sitting down with Ben and answering your questions. And maybe I shouldn't completely retire from PowerPoint after all. But...
So two things. One, how about another round of applause for Mr. Allen Carroll? Two, it is with great appreciation because I can barely operate my own technology, let alone operate somebody else's technology. So Alan, kudos to you for working through all of that. And folks, we did mention there's a QR code. We have it on a little tiny screen, my screen up here right now, in case you want to get it at the end. We'll find a way to make sure that you have access to that because this is so wonderful. It's such a rich storytelling platform. And I'm so glad that you could share this with us tonight, Alan, and talk about that. As somebody who works so much in words, I'm drawn to the words you choose, maps as verbs. I love that. When did you come to that realization that they're no longer nouns for you, they're verbs?
I can't recall the moment of enlightenment, but it's been a while back now. It was when I was still at National Geographic and becoming aware of this amazing community and this amazing capability that geographic information systems brings. And again, that's the intersection of multiple things, computers first and foremost, but the process of increasing computer power, the development and aggregation and sharing of data, which is so important. So this amazing GIS community is not only creating data for their own organization, but they're increasingly realizing that if they share that data with the world, then other people can use that data in ways they never anticipated. So that's another way that maps are verbs, not just in terms of you're interacting with them, but the way they now essentially zoom across the world to benefit all sorts of people and organizations.
Sticking with words for a second, when you introduced the concept of cartography, choreography, the idea that there's a choreography to maps and that they're dancing and they're singing, what was that conversation like amongst your teams to say, we think this is something that can be choreographed, using that word?
Yeah, and I didn't invent that term. I was a member of the team that invented the term map choreography, and I thought it's just perfect. It was that kind of developed as we developed these immersive capabilities. So we really, with this thing we call sidecar, where the background stays static for a little bit and a panel scrolls by, and then we realized, oh, you can do that not just to present a series of maps, but that map can move and it can change, it can show one layer and then another, and you can mix that, do a map in one frame and then an image and go back to that map. So it really, suddenly our maps are dancing. Another key point there was that our research has shown that most people don't bother to interact directly with maps that much. They find it, maybe tedious or something. So we can use we can build story maps so that it simulates interactivity, and it takes people to exactly where and what theme we want them to be taken to, but it still has that sort of freedom and the ability. People can still interact with the map, they can still move on from it, but we kind of do the default choreography that then people can then kind of hijack?
I think it was earlier in the day when we were meeting with the heads of the planning departments for the county and the city. When you might have told them this statistic, and I had heard it, and I thought it was powerful, that people spend a longer time on story maps than they do a website, because I think we think of all the things competing for our eyeballs these days. Gosh, there's a lot. And we look at websites and we move on to the next thing, we move on to the next thing. People stick around on story maps for a long time. How long and why?
Yeah, well, why? We like to think it's simply more engaging than looking at an otherwise relatively static web page. But I can't say we have superb analytics, but the studies we've shown do indicate that people spend about 30 seconds on a typical web page. But any one of the story maps we produce, people spend something like 6.5 minutes, and that's average too. And that 6.5 minutes doesn't sound very long, but in terms of internet time, it's an eternity. And it also, means that some people are spending 20, 30 minutes on a story.
Well, and I think that 6 minutes is likely longer than sometimes we think, because even now we see, I think such a recognition of time spent on pages that even articles that are posted, it says this is a 2-minute read, a 5-minute read, a 10-minute read. Warning, 6 minutes seems like a lot of time. An Allen Carroll question for you. You said you would only leave the job you were in for the perfect job if it happened to be the art department of Nat Geo. What made that the perfect job for you at that time? Your path to then joining the art department of National Geographic, and then we'll talk about your path into Esri. But what made that the perfect job for you?
Yeah, good question. Well, part of it is growing up with my grandmother lived not too far from us, and she had a little yellow room in the back of her house, and that room was yellow mainly because she had National Geographics going back to the 1920s, and I would pore over those magazines. I inherited them, and it was only a few years ago that we finally said we got to get rid of these things. At any rate, I just loved National Geographic. I loved learning about the world, and a lot of people dream of being a photographer at National Geographic, and I'm an amateur photographer. But my love and some ability is in the design realm, and design and illustration, and so that just seemed like the perfect fit. And it was, by the way, I ultimately became head of the art department of the magazine, and I again thought this is the perfect job. But after a little while, some of the same kind of articles started to come around a second time, and I thought, this is starting to get a little repetitive. And so the opportunity came up to go back to the map division to lead it. And I thought, there's where the possibilities, especially in the early days of the internet, there's where the possibilities are endless. And so I gave that up to go make maps.
And I think your recognition of the attention of detail to making maps, who's making them, who are they being made for, and who are they impacting as an audience, I think is one of the things that just really impresses me and has had my attention. I love that quote that you shared earlier on in your presentation of whose dreams, the point of whose dreams. So when it comes to now using a platform like Story Maps, where people can create this interactive experience, we saw some of that today in Erie with the county department, looking at ways that maps have the power to tell the stories that maybe we've turned our eyes away from for so long: inequity, inequality. Where do you see people who are using story maps use that to tell the undertold stories that we've ignored for too long?
We're seeing it more and more. I urge you just to try Googling X story maps. So redlining story maps, or social justice story maps, and you'll start to see examples that people have created. One of the challenges with historical inequities is historical data can be hard to come by. So those redlining maps that were done back in, I'm not sure, 40s, 50s, maybe earlier, are a precious resource. And there's not, of course, there's some census data that's available, but that's one of the challenges is we're getting more and more really rich data accessible to us, but not enough historical data, and that just requires a lot of course, hands-on work.
I think that in one way, Story Maps has empowered us all to be map makers, or at least map engagers to do that, and I think that really makes it a big we that can do this. With a community like Erie, how can we be using a tool like this, or just even thinking about maps? We elected leaders, community leaders, but we, the people, how can we use a platform like this, use maps to address policy change, toward things like inequity, or things that have gone long unaddressed or still need to be addressed or fixed? How do we use that, leaders and us common people like me?
Yeah, it's a bit more of a challenge for common people, because it does take the process of putting a story map together is relatively simple and straightforward. The process of finding and refining and presenting GIS data and representing it cartographically, et cetera, is still harder perhaps than it should be, and still tends to fall in the realm of organizations and professionals. But that's not to say that a more dedicated and somewhat tech savvy individual can't and doesn't use these tools to state to expose an issue, or get people excited about or committed to a problem, to solving a problem.
So how do we address the challenge of getting more people who have a background experience in GIS working at the community level? Are there communities that are doing that well in terms of making sure their planning departments are staffed up, making sure that they have GIS analysts? What can a community do to empower itself around that if it needs a little bit of a lift?
Several things. I mean, one is, find the budget to hire a couple of GIS people. But also to understand its power, not just to help a city, say, run itself, but also to help its city inform its citizens. Just like the map the story I tried to show you about fitness in Erie. So the city might know what needs to be done, but without the mandate that informed citizens can provide, it's not going to do that. Another thing that a city and all of us can do is work with local universities like Gannon to invite, to help spread the word about the power of GIS and storytelling specifically, and to get students working and working with city governments to map and describe some of these things. So there's lots of examples of. I know of a high school teacher in California who unleashed his 8th grade students on a intersection in their town in the Central Valley, and they mapped the distribution of litter and realized there was no litter basket near the bus stop. And they convinced the city to put a litter basket there, which is a minor thing, but those 8th graders made a difference in their community. So, these things can be really empowering.
So I was just about to remind the audience, you're an important part of this conversation. I'd love to get your questions. And it's as if by magic, they appeared in my hand, not by magic. But thank you, Raven, for bringing these up. We've got plenty that we want to get to. And I'm going to choose some time here with one more question that I'm going to ask, so I can take a look through yours and start to pace those out. And Alan, I'm wondering the role of, so let me reframe that. I think on the one hand, people are going to be very excited that they have the opportunity to go and create and be exposed to more maps and see more things. On the other hand, I wonder if people are cautious or concerned about the ability to just go in and create and make. And I say that under the idea of we live in the era of misinformation, disinformation. How do we govern to make sure maps are accurate? The stories that are being told are accurate. Are there gatekeepers? Are there editors? Are there fact checkers? How do we make sure that we're not loosing something upon the world that will misinform or disinform an audience?
So that's a really good question, an important issue, which happily so far hasn't been that much of an issue. So somehow, miraculously, maps have largely escaped the misinformation, fake non-news type stuff that's been going on. But actually, Jim Fallows, who of course some of you have seen speak at a previous visit to Esri for its virtual user conference back during the pandemic, raised this issue. And he and Jack and Gary Nell, former CEO of National Geographic, discussed it and talked about the need for sort of cartographic ethics. And so a number of us in the community, myself playing only a very minor role, have actually done a good bit of thinking about that. And there are several kind of summary. I came up with the term. The only credit I can take for this is a cute name. I said, let's call it the Mapmaker's mantra, and just summarize as briefly as possible the kinds of things that we as cartographers should be thinking about and doing. And so, in other words, another way to think about this is that I think the map makers themselves are the first line of defense. If we recognize that we have a ethical responsibility and kind of look over our shoulders at our peers to make sure they're exercising it as well, then we might avoid problems before they really become problems.
So Alan, thank you for that. And thank you, audience, for all of your great questions. They are all fantastic. We're going to work to work our way through as many of these as we can get through before we conclude tonight's event. And we have a lot here asking about a whole range of topics. So what I want to start with is how do you reconcile the immediate adaptability of digital maps in GIS with the historical value of static printed maps using to explore historical context?
Well, I think if I interpret the question right, it touches on my concern that I haven't really done anything about, but my concern that these digital maps, as wonderful as they are, these stories that come out of them or use them are ephemeral. And we, often think that paper is, that's ephemeral too. But of course, paper is an incredibly, as long as you keep it away from fire, it lasts a really, really long time. So, so there's a tension between two mediums that aren't easy to reconcile without a lot of manual work. But there's also the concern that in this blizzard of information we're getting, geographic, cartographic, and otherwise, a lot's just going to get lost that, that people aren't paying enough attention to.
So one, I'll say on words, be careful with that B word here in Erie, Pennsylvania, of blizzard. We've lucked out so far with great weather during the global summit. Two, on words, tension. I want to stick with that because I think this plays right into this next question, because this person's, thinking about too, as we bridge this transition between traditional mediums and now new mediums with digital capabilities, saying that the GPS, with all its benefits, this person writes, with all its benefits, has a downside. They say, we're losing the ability to read, understand, process, and use the information contained in and on maps, including the ability to navigate. What are the implications?
Yeah, there is a tension there, and a real irony that now that we've got maps in our pockets, we don't need to, we kind of lose track of the larger context. So the former president of the society, a different Gilbert Grosvenor, used to tell a story about being somewhere in Germany and encountering a bunch of kids or young adults in a car, and they didn't. I'm not sure, he might have been in Belgium or something, but the kids didn't know what country they were in. They were just going from point A to point B. So, maybe that's another part of our responsibility as map makers, is to try to get some of that context in. I think that's one of the things that Story Maps does. Story Maps is a lot more than just a navigation tool. It's a storytelling tool via which I think we can illustrate and demonstrate some of the insights that maps and geography can provide.
I think that's an exciting new frontier that you could help on, because I say this realizing that while not entirely young, I'm not entirely old, but I will date myself, and I remember back when printing out MapQuest to go somewhere before we had digital GPS like TomTom or now Waze or any of the applications. So I think integrating that into that, making it more of an experience than just simply a point and click tool, because I do fear the risk sometimes that if Waze tells me to turn left, I'm going to turn left. And if it's into the lake, I'm going to end up in a lake because I'm doing what the machine tells me. But I think that we have that power to really improve that with what you're doing. And I think that, again, I think one of the last questions we have here on back in the day, literally in quotes on our card here. Could you speak to how, and I think we're looking at the love and appreciation and the artistry of making maps. Could you speak to how they made maps back in the day before they could get aerial views? And this person's thinking, you know, the mid 1800s they offer as an example, when map detail was very good, but the tech very limited. How were maps made then? And then how is technology improving our ability to really capture what it is that's around us today?
Well, that's a huge question, and I'm not really the best person to answer because I'm not that up on the history of cartography and cartographic practices. But of course, it was all essentially hand drawn, but also remarkably accurate, given that none of these digital tools were available. It's a fascinating book on the I think it's called The Great Arc, on the mapping of the Indian subcontinent, using these old tools and the tools of trigonometry to map with amazing accuracy of what various parts of the pink bits, the British Empire. But yeah, so it's remarkable how skilled those early cartographers were with none of the incredibly powerful tools that we have now, especially, of course, the ability of GPS and satellite imagery to map and represent things at high accuracy.
This person must have hung on to the point that you were making of the power of story maps now in education and seeing students use that. How do you see that changing? This person's asking, how do you see story maps changing and impacting the education system the quickest right now? What do you anticipate being the longer term impact?
Well, I just like to think, well, maybe back up a little bit. We about 20, 30 years ago, of course, many colleges and universities quietly or not so quietly abolished their geography departments. And geography is returning to colleges and universities, but for the most part in a very different form. So people aren't forming geography departments. They're forming geospatial centers, or they're hiring GIS librarians, and so many college and university libraries are serving departments around the campus. And to me, that's a wonderful solution, because geography is unique in that it impacts almost every discipline, and so setting it as a sort of standalone thing kind of takes some of its value and insight away. But when it's applied not just across the sciences, but also the humanities, digital humanities is a thriving realm these days. So applying maps to things like redlining and environmental justice and things like that, provides lots and lots of important insights. I'm not sure I answered the question very well, but that's a stab.
No, I think that's great. And this person wants to take a stab at getting started on making a story map. What kind of story map topics, if you have recommendations, topics, would you recommend for a beginner? How do I get started? This person asks.
Well, just go to storymaps.arcgis.com and take a look at some of our instructional materials, try it out for yourself. Also start to explore the living atlas of the world. So just Google Esri Living Atlas, and you'll get to this resource. Hundreds of authoritative maps that are being shared within and by and for the GIS community. We're in the process of doing a second level. We're just starting the process of doing second level curation of those living atlas maps, because a lot of them are made for and by, as I said, geographic information system specialists, but they're not as user-friendly and as beautiful and as performant as they could be. And so we're actually working with National Geographic on it, and a textbook publisher named Cengage on a program to bring geography back into the classroom using story maps and an easy to use map viewer. So that's a project that's just getting underway.
So, Allen, you had a interesting and experienced path to getting to where you are. This person, and you just mentioned students and getting it back in the classroom. This person's asking, what opportunities for employment do you see GIS students having? Prospects, direction you would give them?
This is a great field to go in, because there are jobs. There are real jobs in lots of different situations. So, of course, local government, other colleges and universities, and county, state, regional, national governments, many nonprofits. All the conservation nonprofits are using GIS very actively. So there are plenty of jobs to be had. And in fact, a few years ago, the U.S. Department of Labor identified the geospatial realm as one of the particular areas of opportunity for employment of young people.
So two different questions here, both dealing with flat Earth. Has anybody tried to create a flat Earth story map? And what do you do when you come across flat Earth maps and people who want to talk about them?
I tend not to listen real well, I guess. I guess we're depicting a flat Earth all the time. So of course, a projection is taking the round Earth and flattening it for the purposes of display and interaction. So in a way, I guess I'm a flat Earth person, but I do know that the real one is spherical, or roughly so.
Are you, in the next two questions are dealing with, I think, a question on so many people's minds of what do we do about climate change, and then thinking about the roles of maps and now story maps in addressing climate change. And I couldn't help but think of heat.gov, with the federal government just put out using Esri technology, being able to map that and how powerful that is. And I'd really recommend people go and look at that as a resource to be able to track that. This person is asking, are you aware of anyone working on a story map about likely sea level rise and population density in those regions?
Sure, there's a lot of work being done on sea level rise. We worked with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a year or two ago about on a story on sea level rise. They used the Newport News, Norfolk, Virginia area as an example. So yeah, there are probably hundreds of story maps out there on of course on climate change. In addition to heat.gov, Esri is very closely involved with the White House and federal partners on climate.gov. That's a rich source of information about climate change.
So I think you answered it, but I'll leave the door open in case there's additional information or resources you want to point people to. But that's what the next question was: is where can I go see story maps about climate change and anything in the Esri suite that I can find more information about how it's being mapped today? Is there anywhere else you'd point people, Alan?
Well, NOAA is definitely a place to go. I'm trying to think. I've actually another feature of ArcGIS story maps is you can create collection pages, and I've created a little collection of climate stories. And if I had that person's contact info, I could point them to it. It might be visible via a Google search, but it's something I just kind of created for my own purposes. One of the things we're hoping to do in 2023 is launch a Story Maps e-magazine that would feature monthly at first, but ultimately weekly, feature a handful of story maps on various themes like climate and biodiversity and you name it. So stay tuned.
Sign me up immediately. I want to get that. I think that would be great. We are sitting in a nonprofit right now, and we have somebody asking what the role of story maps and storytelling is for nonprofits using this application. How do you see nonprofits using this outside of schools, as we've already talked about?
Well, they're using it now in many different ways. Another reason I like and I'm proud to work at Esri is that we've got a nonprofit program that offers steep discounts, not just for story maps, but for the whole GIS suite to nonprofit organizations. So something like 80–90% discounts. So thousands of nonprofit organizations are using GIS, but many hundreds of those are also leveraging the maps they create in the form of story maps. This is especially in the conservation and sustainability realm, but increasingly in humanitarian and social justice realms as well.
And I think one of one, kudos to Esri and thank you, Esri, for that in that entire suite of platforms. Because I think one of the things that draws me to story maps is the integration of the other applications of Esri, being able to use something like Survey 123. Where do you see that being used the most when it comes to community level engagement, local level engagement, people using a tool like that to go out and talk to citizens, talk to residents, and then create a story around that for their town?
I'm not really up to speed on the many uses of Survey 123 and where it's used, but it's a great and quite powerful, simple crowdsourcing technique that can be integrated nicely with story maps. So one of the things you can do with story maps is embed other things within it, like my unsuccessful attempt to show a story map within a story map. So you can easily present and talk about an issue, and then at the end solicit people's feedback about it, either in general or ask them very specific questions about, say, let us know if you've got a problem in your neighborhood or something like that.
So we just talked about nonprofits using story maps. Where do you see journalists in this fitting into media when people are storytelling? And I know I have an answer for that because our towns actually uses story maps. We use that to tell stories. But where do you see this fitting in for journalists?
Yeah, well, I think that's got tremendous utility for journalists. I've been disappointed that it hasn't been used more. So if there's anything in this really happy story about the success of story maps that has been a disappointment is that journalists haven't picked it up as much as I wish they had. So the big news organizations like especially the New York Times, but others like Reuters and the Washington Post are doing beautiful multimedia map-based stories. They're producing them themselves because they've got they can afford to have full-time paid staffs creating these things. And it's been my hope all along that story maps can be a pretty good substitute for a half dozen developers and designers. And that media organizations, especially newspapers, are really cash strapped these days. But it hasn't happened. I think a couple of reasons. One is they're kind of tradition bound and a little slow to embrace new technology. And they're so busy just trying to stay afloat that they don't, they may not have time to explore these new solutions. But there have been some exciting examples, including Jim and Deb Fallows and our town's civic foundation, but not nearly as many as I had hoped, frankly.
So one of the things we can make a New Year's resolution for 2023 is to get story maps into the hands of more journalists. Adam, I think we'll talk about Erie Reader and how we can do this soon. Locally, at least, this person's asking, I think maybe thinking back to when I was talking about Garmin and I was talking about some of the other apps. Do you have any affiliations with Google Maps, Garmin, any other navigation software that Esri is working with or helps empower relationships that might be worthwhile exploring and talking about?
Not too many. Google is a sort of frenemy in some ways. They're kind of a competitor, not direct, but they're also the kind of the 1,000-pound gorilla, and they have their own agenda. Of course, so does Esri, but they're quite different agendas, and so it's been a little hard to make them kind of come together. We think the new consumer story maps has real potential, and are actually talking to some providers of things like outdoor, we're not talking to Strava, but that sort of thing that, say an outdoor enthusiast might track his or her routes, or make a GoPro film or something, and that we might work with them, or so-called white label story maps for them to use. But those are early discussions.
So you talked earlier about, this is housed on Esri's cloud. Esri is based in Redlands, California. We talked earlier about, people are not using this for nefarious reasons. We don't see people making maps about disinformation or misinformation, but this person is concerned. Do you worry? What keeps you up at night thinking about what might come of the platform or risks that are ahead? Thinking in this person's example of, TikTok that we worry about in terms of where the data is stored, and then thinking about Twitter in terms of bots trying to sabotage us. What keeps Allen Carroll up at night about story maps?
Happily, I'm not a great sleeper, but that's not usually what keeps me awake that much. I'm still having enough fun, but and again, I don't see a lot of abuses yet. So yeah, I think I sleep reasonably well. I mean, in the back of our minds are some of the ethical issues and the potential for abuse, but just so relieved that we've seen miraculously little actual abuse to this point. We do, our lawyer sometimes gets involved when a photographer or a photographer's agent will say this photograph has been used illegally, but it's almost always a student who didn't know better that has, grabbed a photo off the web that he or she didn't realize wasn't, was rights protected. So but that's a pretty trivial level of abuse. That's not enough to keep me awake.
So you'll forgive me. This is something I'm hearing of for the first time. I'm not familiar with it, Alan. Maybe you are, and maybe you can answer this person's question. But this person asks, is there any validity to the conspiracy that Google censors aerial views of Antarctica to hide crypto-archaeological features? I've never heard that. Have you?
I've never heard it, know nothing about it, and I'm kind of skeptical.
So we can find that person in the back of the room at the end. We can hear more about that from you and talk about that. Alan, I have one last question, which I'll ask, and it's to the effect of, if there is a most important lesson that the geography can teach us, what do you think that is, and what do you think story maps' role in that is? Before I ask you that question, I want to take a moment to thank the audience for coming to this event. Any of the other 18 that you attended, whether this was your first one or you went to all 19, we thank you, thank you, thank you. The Global Summit, the entire work of the JES does not happen without you, our audience. You are an integral part of this. Without you, we would not happen. So thank you. This has been such a wonderful summit, at least in my estimation, in my experience. It's been such a joy being with you all. It's been a joy getting an opportunity to be on the stage with several folks throughout the run of this, including Mr. Allen Carroll, who I want to thank so much for joining us here and being with us, telling us about map making and storytelling and how we're opening minds and the power of the work that he's doing, and really the future of map making. I want to encourage people to remember, this is not the end. The lights are still on tomorrow. Your Jefferson Educational Society is still busy at work putting out great publications and continuing with great events. So tune in, go see our website, jeserie.org. And lastly, again, a huge thanks to our entire team under the leadership of our president, Dr. Ferky Ferrati. Give a wave, Ferky, you're in the back. I want to thank all of them, hardworking folks who believe in this mission. So grateful to you, grateful to all of our presenters, grateful for the team. This has been such a wonderful experience for me. I sort of don't want it to end, which is probably why I'm taking so long to get to that final question, but I'll get to that final question now, Alan, and ask you what the most important lesson you think geography has to teach us right now, and the role that story maps plays in that.
That's a toughie, but an exciting opportunity. So first, one is I'm always learning, thanks to learning about the insights that geography has to offer. I'm also continue to learn about presenting it. So from now on, I will use my own laptop so that I know how to scroll and won't have these embarrassing faux pas. So I apologize for that, and thank you for your patience. Geography and story maps in particular, I think just offer insights about a world that is so precious to us, and the continued health of which is all of our responsibility. And we are at this absolutely critical moment. And I think the tools of geographic information systems, and a very small part, the ability of story maps to help get the word out about the insights that GIS can offer, is just it's going to be a critical tool for us to kind of figure out how we continue to get through this and work toward a future that is bright and sustainable and healthy for our kids and grandkids.
Head to our website to get access to that story map, to see it, and the many more things we can learn from Mr. Allen Carroll. Mr. Allen Carroll, thank you so much for joining us here and sharing your work with us in the Global Summit stage.
Thank you. Appreciate it.